Clement Attlee formed the Attlee Ministry in the United Kingdom in 1945, succeeding Winston Churchill as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. It won a landslide victory in 1945, enacting much of the post-war consensus policies, especially the welfare state and nationalization of some industries. It worked to reduce the severity of economic austerity, gave independence to India, and engaged in the Cold War against Soviet Communism. It was narrowly re-elected in 1950, and narrowly defeated in 1951. Leaders. The Labour Party came to power in the United Kingdom after its unexpected victory in the July 1945 general elections. Party leader Clement Attlee became Prime Minister, replacing Winston Churchill in late July. Ernest Bevin was Foreign Secretary until shortly before his death in April 1951. Hugh Dalton became Chancellor of the Exchequer, but had to resign in 1947, while James Tutor-Reid was Home Secretary for the whole length of the party's stay in power. Other notable figures in the government included Herbert Morrison, Deputy Prime Minister and Leader of the House of Commons, who replaced Bevin as Foreign Secretary in March 1951. Sir Stafford Cripps was initially President of the Board of Trade but replaced Dalton as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1947. Hugh Gaitskell held several minor posts before replacing Cripps as Chancellor in 1950. Bevin was Minister for Health. Arthur Greenwood was Lord Privy Seal and Paymaster General, while future Prime Minister Harold Wilson became the youngest member of the Cabinet in the 20th century when he was made President of the Board of Trade in 1947. The most notable of the few female members of the government was Ellen Wilkinson, who was Minister for Education until her early death in 1947. Policies. It was an age of austerity, as wartime rationing was continued and even expanded to cover bread. Living conditions were poor. Instead of expansion, it was a matter of replacing the national wealth destroyed or used up during the war. The Great Depression did not return, and full employment was the norm. Returning veterans were successfully reabsorbed into the economy and society. The Attlee government nationalized about 20% of the economy, including coal, railways, road transport, the Bank of England, civil aviation, cable and wireless, electricity and gas, and steel. However, there was no money for investment to modernize these industries, and there was no effort made to turn control over to union members. The Attlee government greatly expanded the welfare state, with the Family Allowances Act and especially the National Health Service Act of 1946, which nationalized the hospitals and provided for free universal medical care. The National Insurance Act of 1946 provided sickness and unemployment benefits for adults, plus retirement pensions. The National Assistance Act of 1948 provided a safety net for anyone not otherwise covered. The Education Act of 1944 was expanded, more council housing was built, and plans were made through the New Towns Act of 1946 for the growth of suburbs. Since there was little money for detailed planning, the government adopted Keynesianism, which allowed for planning in the sense of overall control of the national deficit and surplus. The Transport Act 1947 established the British Transport Commission, taking over the railways from the Big Four, being the Great Western Railway, London, Midland and Scottish Railway, London and North Eastern Railway, and the Southern Railway to form British Railways. In foreign affairs, the government was active in the United Nations and negotiated a $5 billion loan from the U.S. and Canada in 1946. It eagerly joined the Marshall Plan in 1948. It could no longer afford to support the Greek government and encouraged the U.S. to take its place through the Truman Doctrine in 1947. It took an active role in joining the United States in the Cold War and forming NATO. It gave independence to India, Pakistan, Ceylon and Burma and moved to strengthen the British Commonwealth. Nationalization projects 1945–51. The Labour Party comes to power with a program for nationalizing weak sectors of the economy. 1946. Coal industry under the National Coal Board. 1946 Bank of England. 1946 National Health Service created, taking over hospitals and making medical services free. NHS started operations in 1948. 1947 Central Electricity Generating Board and Area Electricity Boards. 1947 Cable and AMP Wireless. 1948 National Rail, Inland Water Transport, some road haulage, some road passenger transport and Thomas Cook and AMP Sun under the British Transport Commission. Separate elements operated as British Railways, British Road Services, and British Waterways. 1949 Local authority gas supply undertakings in England, Scotland and Wales. 1951 Iron and steel industry. Post-war consensus. Most historians argue that the main domestic policies reflected a broad bipartisan consensus. The post-war consensus is a historian's model of political agreement from 1945 to the late 1970s. In 1979, newly elected Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher rejected and reversed it. The concept claims there was a widespread consensus that covered support for coherent package of policies that were developed in the 1930s, promised during the Second World War, and enacted under Attlee. The policies dealt with a mixed economy, Keynesianism, and a broad welfare state. In recent years, the validity of the interpretation has been debated by historians. The historian's model of the post-war consensus was most fully developed by Paul Addison. The basic argument is that in the 1930s, Liberal Party intellectuals led by John Maynard Keynes and William Beveridge developed a series of plans that became especially attractive as the wartime government promised a much better post-war Britain and saw the need to engage every sector of society. The coalition government during the war, headed by Churchill and Attlee, signed off on a series of white papers that promised Britain a much improved welfare state. After the war, the promises included the National Health Service and expansion of education, housing, and a number of welfare programs. It did not include the nationalization of iron and steel, which was approved only by the Labour Party. The model states that from 1945 until the arrival of Thatcher in 1979, there was a broad multi-partisan national consensus on social and economic policy, especially regarding the welfare state, nationalized health services, educational reform, a mixed economy, government regulation, Keynesian macroeconomic policies, and full employment. Apart from the question of nationalization of some industries, these policies were broadly accepted by the three major parties, as well as by industry, the financial community and the labor movement. Until the 1980s, historians generally agreed on the existence and importance of the consensus. Some historians such as Ralph Miliband expressed disappointment that the consensus was a modest or even conservative package that blocked a fully socialized society. Historian Angus Calder complained bitterly that the post-war reforms were an inadequate reward for the wartime sacrifices, and a cynical betrayal of the people's hope for a more just post-war society. In recent years, there has been a historiographical debate on whether such a consensus ever existed. Fate The Labour Party narrowly defeated the Conservative Party at the February 1950 general election. However, in the October 1951 general elections, the Conservatives returned to power under Winston Churchill. Labour was to remain out of office for the next 13 years, until 1964, when Harold Wilson became Prime Minister. Cabinets 1945–1950 Clement Attlee, Prime Minister and Minister of Defence. Lord Jowett, Lord Chancellor. Herbert Morrison, Deputy Prime Minister, Lord President of the Council and Leader of the House of Commons. Arthur Greenwood, Lord Privy Seal. Hugh Dalton, Chancellor of the Exchequer. Ernest Bevin, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. James Tudor Reid, Secretary of State for the Home Department. George Henry Hall, Secretary of State for the Colonies. Lord Addison, Secretary of State for Dominion Affairs and Leader of the House of Lords. Lord Pethick Lawrence, Secretary of State for India and Burma. A.V. Alexander, First Lord of the Admiralty. Jack Lawson, Secretary of State for War. Lord Stansgate, Secretary of State for Air. Ellen Wilkinson, Minister of Education. Joseph Westwood, Secretary of State for Scotland. Tom Williams, Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries. George Isaacs, Minister of Labour and National Service. Aneurin Bevan, Minister of Health. Sir Stafford Cripps, President of the Board of Trade. Emmanuel Shinwell, Minister of Fuel and Power. Changes July 1946 – Arthur Greenwood becomes Paymaster General as well as Lord Privy Seal. October 1946 – The three service ministers cease to be cabinet positions. A.V. Alexander remains in the cabinet as minister without portfolio. George Hall replaces A.V. Alexander as First Lord of the Admiralty outside the cabinet. Arthur Creech Jones succeeds Hall as Secretary of State for the Colonies. December 1946 A.V. Alexander succeeds Attlee as Minister of Defence. February 1947 George Tomlinson succeeds Ellen Wilkinson as Minister of Education upon her death. March 1947 Arthur Greenwood ceases to be Paymaster General, remaining Lord Privy Seal. His successor as Paymaster General is not in the cabinet. April 1947 Arthur Greenwood becomes Minister without portfolio. Lord Inman succeeds Arthur Greenwood as Lord Privy Seal. William Francis Hare, Lord Listowel succeeds Lord Pethick Lawrence as Secretary of State for India and Burma. July 1947 The Dominion Affairs Office becomes the Office of Commonwealth Relations. Addison remains at the head. August 1947 The India and Burma Office becomes the Burma Office with India's independence. Lord Listowel remains in office. Responsibility for relations with India and Pakistan themselves are transferred to Addison and the Commonwealth Relations Office. September 1947 Sir Stafford Cripps becomes Minister of Economic Affairs. Harold Wilson succeeds Cripps as President of the Board of Trade. Arthur Greenwood retires from the front bench. October 1947 Lord Addison succeeds Lord Inman as Lord Privy Seal, remaining also Leader of the House of Lords. Philip Noel Baker succeeds Lord Addison as Secretary of State for Commonwealth Relations. Arthur Woodburn succeeds Joseph Westwood as Secretary of State for Scotland. The Minister of Fuel and Power, Emmanuel Shinwell, leaves the cabinet. November 1947 Sir Stafford Cripps succeeds Hugh Dalton as Chancellor of the Exchequer. January 1948 The Burma Office is abolished with Burma's independence. May 1948 Hugh Dalton re-enters the cabinet as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Lord Pakenham enters the Cabinet as Minister of Civil Aviation. July 1948, Lord Addison becomes Paymaster General. April 1949, Lord Addison ceases to be Paymaster General, remaining Lord Privy Seal and Leader of the House of Lords. His successor as Paymaster General is not in the Cabinet. In February 1950, a substantial reshuffle took place following the general election. Clement Attlee, Prime Minister; Lord Jowett, Lord Chancellor; Herbert Morrison, Deputy Prime Minister, Lord President of the Council and Leader of the House of Commons; Lord Addison, Lord Privy Seal and Leader of the House of Lords; Sir Stafford Cripps, Chancellor of the Exchequer; Ernest Bevin, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs; James Tudor Reid, Secretary of State for the Home Department; Jim Griffiths, Secretary of State for the Colonies; Patrick Gordon Walker, Secretary of State for Commonwealth Relations; Harold Wilson, President of the Board of Trade; Lord Alexander of Hillsborough, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster; George Tomlinson, Minister of Education; Hector McNeill, Secretary of State for Scotland; Tom Williams, Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries; George Isaacs, Minister of Labour and National Service; Aneurin Bevan, Minister of Health; Emmanuel Shinwell, Minister of Defence; Hugh Dalton, Minister of Town and Country Planning. Changes October 1950, Hugh Gaitskell succeeds Sir Stafford Cripps as Chancellor of the Exchequer. January 1951, Aneurin Bevan succeeds George Isaacs as Minister of Labour and National Service. Bevan's successor as Minister of Health is not in the Cabinet. Hugh Dalton's post is renamed Minister of Local Government and Planning. March 1951, Herbert Morrison succeeds Ernest Bevin as Foreign Secretary. Lord Addison succeeds Morrison as Lord President. Bevin succeeds Addison as Lord Privy Seal. James Tudor Reid succeeds Morrison as Leader of the House of Commons whilst remaining Home Secretary. April 1951, Richard Stokes succeeds Ernest Bevin as Lord Privy Seal. Alf Robins succeeds Aneurin Bevan as Minister of Labour and National Service. Sir Hartley Shawcross succeeds Harold Wilson as President of the Board of Trade. List of Ministers. Members of the Cabinet are in boldface. Major legislation enacted during the Attlee government. Law Reform Act 1945. Housing Act 1946. Coal Industry Nationalization Act 1946. Furnished Houses Act 1946. National Health Service Act 1946. National Insurance Act 1946. National Insurance Act 1946. New Towns Act 1946. Trade Disputes and Trade Unions Act 1946. Hill Farming Act 1946. Agriculture Act 1947. Pensions Act 1947. Electricity Act 1947. Town and Country Planning Act 1947. Transport Act 1947. National Assistance Act 1948. Children Act 1948. Factories Act 1948. Education Act 1948. Agricultural Holdings Act 1948. Employment and Training Act 1948. Nurseries and Childminders Regulation Act 1948. Law Reform Act 1948. Local Government Act 1948. Representation of the People Act 1948. Housing Act 1949. Superannuation Act 1949. House of Commons Act 1949. Landlord and Tenant Act 1949. Lands Tribunal Act 1949. Legal Aid and Advice Act 1949. Adoption of Children Act 1949. Marriage Act 1949, National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act 1949, Parliament Act 1949, Representation of the People Act 1949, Distribution of Industry Act 1950, Coal Mining Act 1950, Allotments Act 1950.